The gavel's sharp crack was a sound no thicker than a twig snapping, yet it broke the entire frame of her world. Agnes felt the vibration not in her ears but in the soles of her worn boots, a tremor traveling from the courthouse floorboards up through her bones. It was done! The farm, the house her husband had built, the very soil that held his sweat and now his body, it all belonged to the bank. The man with the tidy mustache and mercilessly clean fingernails, a Mr. Finch, slid a single folded document across the polished table. It was not a reprieve. It was the deed to the last remnant, the parcel nobody wanted, a sliver of limestone badlands on the county's western edge, deemed worthless for grazing, worthless for farming, worthless for anything but holding the territory together. It had a cave on it, that was its only distinguishing feature, a feature most considered a liability, a wound in the earth. He offered it as a settlement of the final, lingering accounts, a gesture that cost him nothing and gave her less than that. Agnes took the paper. Its crispness felt like an insult against her calloused fingers. She had $2.17 left, a small, cold weight in her pocket that had to last a lifetime. Outside, the autumn air was turning sharp, a promise of the hardship to come. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the proceedings averted their eyes, their pity a useless, suffocating blanket. She was a widow, now unlanded, a ghost in the making. She walked away from the courthouse without looking back, the sound of her own footsteps on the dusty street the only companion she had. The decision was not a choice but an inevitability, a conclusion drawn from a brutal arithmetic of subtraction. There was only one place to go. The place of rocks and shadows. The place everyone had always joked about. Her last and only possession. She went back to the house that was no longer hers to gather the few things the bank did not consider part of the property, a cast-iron skillet, a wool blanket, a small axe, a sack of dried beans, her husband's oil lantern, and a small crate containing 3 nervous chickens. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury, a currency she could not afford to spend. Each object she touched was an anchor to a life that had just sunk beneath the waves. The final act was the hardest. She stood at the door, her hand on the smooth, familiar wood of the latch. For a decade, this door had been the threshold between her world and the wider one. Now, it was a wall. She pulled it shut, and the quiet click echoed the gavel's finality. The sound sealed her past away, leaving her standing under a vast, indifferent sky with nothing but a worthless deed and a future as barren as the land it described. She did not walk toward the horizon, she walked toward the scrap of earth designated on the paper. The journey was a descent, a shedding of community and comfort with every step. The town gave way to furrowed fields, the last of the season's harvest already gathered, leaving behind a stubble that looked like a poorly shaven cheek. Then the fields gave way to scrubland, where the dirt turned pale and thin, clinging reluctantly to the bedrock beneath. By the time she reached the property line, marked by a single, rust-colored iron stake, the sun was low, bleeding orange and purple along the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. The land was precisely as worthless as its reputation suggested. Grey rock jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Gnarled, skeletal bushes were the only vegetation, their leaves already withered. And there, at the base of a low, crumbling escarpment, was the cave. Its mouth was a dark, gaping void, a silent O of surprise on the face of the cliff. It looked less like a shelter and more like a place the earth had forgotten to finish. A cold draught breathed from its depths, carrying a scent of damp stone and ancient stillness. This was her inheritance. This was her refuge. The thought was so stark, so devoid of hope, that a dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips, a sound immediately swallowed by the immense quiet of the Badlands. She set down her meager belongings. The chickens clucked nervously in their crate, their small agitations a fragile counterpoint to the profound desolation of the place. As dusk deepened, the cold intensified, seeping into her bones. She built a small fire near the cave's entrance, its meager flames pushing back the encroaching darkness by a few precious feet. The fire was a temporary defiance, a small pocket of warmth and light in a world that had grown vast and cold. She ate a handful of beans, their blandness a fitting meal for her new life. Later, wrapped in the wool blanket, she lay on the hard ground and watched the stars emerge, cold and impossibly distant. They were the same stars that had shone over her farmhouse, but here, they offered no comfort. They were just points of light in an endless, empty blackness. The first night was a vigil of fear. Every scrape of stone, every rustle of the wind through the dry brush, was a potential threat. But the greatest threat was the one within, the cold, heavy certainty that she had been sent here to die. The cave loomed behind her, a tomb waiting to receive her. She had been cast out, erased from the world of warmth and society, left to expire on a piece of land that was itself a testament to failure. Morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but as a slow, grey dilution of the night. The world resolved itself into shades of brown and grey. She was still alive. The fact was a small, hard kernel of surprise. She rose, her body stiff and aching, and turned to face the cave. It was time to survey her kingdom. She lit the lantern, its golden glow a fragile weapon against the profound darkness within the cave. The entrance was low and wide, but the passage quickly narrowed, the limestone walls slick with a film of moisture that glittered in the light. The air was heavy, still, and colder than the night outside had been. It felt like walking into the belly of some great, sleeping beast. For the first 50 feet, the cave was just a tunnel, its floor an uneven surface of packed earth and fallen rock. She saw the evidence of animals that had sheltered here, old droppings, a few scattered bones, but it was empty now. Despair, a familiar companion, began to settle over her again. This was no shelter, it was a hole, a damp, dark, lifeless hole. She was a fool to have come here, a fool to have imagined anything other than a slow, cold end. She pushed onward, driven by a stubborn refusal to simply lie down and surrender. Her boots crunched on loose gravel. The tunnel began to open up, the ceiling soaring into unseen heights. She held the lantern higher, its light swallowed by the immense volume of the space. She had stepped into a vast chamber, a hidden cathedral of stone. And it was here that she found it. Not one thing, but two. First, the sound. A soft, rhythmic drip. 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 It was the steadiest, most reassuring sound she had heard in months. Following it, she found a place where the wall wept. A slow, constant seep of water, clear and cold, trickled down the rock face into a shallow basin that had been worn into the stone floor over centuries. It was a source of clean water, protected from the elements, immune to the freezing temperatures that would soon grip the land. It was life. Then, as she stood there, mesmerized by the simple miracle of the water, the quality of the light changed. A pale, ethereal beam pierced the darkness from high above, illuminating a circle of the floor in the center of the chamber. She looked up, craning her neck, and saw it, a fissure in the cavern's roof, a long, narrow crack that opened to the sky. For several hours a day, as the sun passed over, this chamber would be bathed in direct, natural light. The air in here was still. The deep rock acted as an insulator, holding a constant, cool temperature, buffering against the brutal heat of summer and the soul-crushing cold of winter. It was not a tomb. It was a fortress. It was a machine. A system for living, powered by geology and light. And in that moment, standing in the beam of sunlight, the impossible idea took root. An idea born of desperation and observation. She looked at the patch of illuminated earth on the cavern floor, then at the steady supply of water. She thought of the sack of seed corn she could buy with the last of her money. It was a mad thought, a farmer's dream in a place where nothing was meant to grow. Planting a crop inside the earth itself. It was an act of rebellion against the verdict the world had passed on her and on this land. For the first time since the gavel fell, a feeling other than grief or fear stirred within her. It was a sliver of something hard and sharp. It was resolve. The work began with the most fundamental element, soil. The floor of the great chamber was mostly stone and clay, unsuitable for cultivation. The thin, scraggly topsoil outside was all she had to work with. The labor was a brutal, repetitive poem of pure physical effort. She used the skillet as a makeshift spade and the empty bean sack for a carrier. Each morning, she would scrape away the meager layer of earth from a patch of the scrubland, filling the sack spoonful by spoonful. The sack, when full, was a dead weight she had to drag and haul 50 feet into the darkness of the cave. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands, soft from a life as a farmer's wife, were soon raw, then blistered, then calloused into thick, leathery pads. The first week, she managed to create a patch of soil in the sunlit circle no bigger than her blanket. It was a pitiful sight, a dark smear on the cavern floor. But it was a start. She discovered another resource in the deeper, darker passages of the cave system, but guano. It was rich, powerful fertilizer, and she spent days scraping the ancient deposits from the rock, her lantern casting long, dancing shadows as she worked in the suffocating blackness. She mixed it into the soil she'd brought inside, her hands turning the earth, feeling its texture, crumbling the clods, preparing a bed for a crop that existed only in her imagination. The physical cost was immense. Every muscle ached. At night, she would collapse onto her blanket, too exhausted to even build a fire, the darkness of the cave a welcome relief from the strain of her labor. She ate sparingly, rationing the beans, knowing that her survival depended on a harvest that was still just a desperate gamble. The 3 chickens were her only companions, their soft clucking and scratching near the cave entrance a small, persistent reminder of a normal, living world. They provided an egg every day or two, a precious globe of protein she treated with the reverence of a sacrament. She was creating a system, a closed loop of effort and sustenance. Water from the wall, light from the ceiling, soil from the land, and energy from her own dwindling reserves. The town, on the rare occasion she thought of it, would have declared her insane. They imagined her shivering in a hole, consumed by grief. They could not conceive of the methodical, focused industry taking place within the rock. They had dismissed her, and in doing so, they had made her invisible. This invisibility was now her greatest asset. It allowed her to work without judgment, to build her strange, subterranean farm in secret, fueled by a purpose so audacious it would have been laughable to anyone but her. By the end of the first month, she had constructed 3 long, raised beds of rich, dark earth, all positioned perfectly within the daily trajectory of the sunbeam. The work had hardened her body and clarified her mind. The cave was no longer a place of exile, it was a workshop, a laboratory, a sanctuary. It was home. The day came when she could put it off no longer. The soil was ready, the season was turning, and her own food supplies were dangerously low. She needed seed corn, salt, and more lamp oil. The trip to town was a necessity she dreaded, a return to the world of averted eyes and whispered judgments. She walked the few miles back toward civilization, the $2 in her pocket feeling both impossibly small and monumentally important. The town looked the same, but it felt different. Or perhaps she was different. The rhythms of commerce and gossip on the main street seemed frivolous, disconnected from the fundamental realities of water, soil, and shelter that now governed her life. She pushed open the door to Hemlock's general store, a bell announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Mr. Hemlock stood behind the counter, a man whose spine seemed to be made of the same rigid wood as his shelves. He looked up, and a flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed his face. He had likely assumed he would never see her again. She walked to the counter, her worn dress and the dirt beneath her fingernails a stark contrast to the store's orderly displays of canned goods and bolts of fabric. "I need seed corn," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "And a gallon of oil." Hemlock raised an eyebrow. "Planting late, aren't you, Agnes?" "First frost is due any week." His tone was not kind. It was the voice of a man confirming his own assumptions. Just then, another man, Roy, who had a small plot of land bordering her old farm, entered the store. He saw her and a slow, cruel grin spread across his face. He leaned against a barrel of pickles, folding his arms. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still kicking. Heard you were living in that old cave. Figured a rockslide might have saved you the trouble of winter." Agnes ignored him, her gaze fixed on Hemlock. "The corn," she repeated. Hemlock made a show of weighing out the seeds, his movement slow and deliberate. Roy continued his performance. "What are you planting in, Agnes? Cracks in the stone? Gonna raise yourself a crop of pebbles?" A few other customers in the store snickered. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks, but she met it with a cold, internal stillness she had cultivated in the cave. She had hauled tons of earth with her bare hands. A few stinging words were nothing. "Heard you're starting a stone farm out there," Roy said, laughing at his own wit. "Maybe you can eat the rocks when your corn don't grow." She placed her coins on the counter, the sound of the metal a sharp finality. She took the sack of seed and the can of oil. As she turned to leave, she paused and looked directly at Roy for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs in the store. "A person has to plant where they can," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the store, the bell jingling her departure, leaving behind a silence thick with their smug certainty. The mockery was a fire in her belly, but it was not a destructive one. It was fuel. They saw a mad, grieving widow. They had no idea they were looking at a farmer about to begin her most important season. Back in the sanctuary of the cave, the insults of the town faded into irrelevance. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and stone, a clean scent that washed away the dust and judgment of the world outside. She laid out the kernels of corn, small, hard, golden promises, and began to plant. The work was meticulous, a ritual of hope performed in the heart of a rock. She pressed each seed into the dark, rich soil of the raised beds, spacing them with the practiced care of a lifetime spent working the land. She was not just planting food, she was planting a future, a defiance of the fate that had been assigned to her. With the planting done, her life settled into a new and steady rhythm, dictated by the sunbeam from the fissure and the needs of her subterranean crop. Her days became a cycle of quiet, focused tasks. Each morning, she would check the soil's moisture, using a small cup to transfer water from the seep to the beds, giving each nascent plant exactly what it needed. During the hours of direct sunlight, she would sit near the beds, simply watching, a silent guardian of the impossible garden. When the sunbeam passed, she would light her lantern, moving it slowly along the rows to provide a few extra hours of weak, artificial light, whispering to the plants as if they were her children. The chickens were a vital part of her system. She had built them a small, secure coop near the entrance, and their daily scratching and soft calls were a constant, living presence. Their eggs were her primary food source, and their droppings were a precious addition to her compost. They were her small flock, her silent dependence, and their simple, routine-driven lives provided an anchor for her own. The world outside the cave ceased to matter. The changing colors of the autumn leaves, the first bite of frost in the air, these were abstract concepts. Her reality was the controlled environment she had built. Her seasons were marked by the unfurling of the first green shoots, a moment of such profound victory that she touched a tender leaf with a trembling finger, tears finally blurring her vision. These were not tears of grief, but of creation. The corn grew, but it grew strangely. Deprived of wind and the full, open sky, the stalks were paler than they should have been, and they grew unnervously straight, reaching for the single source of light high above. They were cave-born things, adapted to their unique world. To an outsider, they might have looked sickly, unnatural. To Agnes, they were beautiful. They were survivors. She talked to them, tended them, and protected them. She was no longer just a woman in a cave, she was a creator, a caretaker, a master of a tiny, self-contained universe, a farmer of the dark. The first green shoots matured into sturdy stalks. The strange, pale corn grew with a quiet, relentless determination that mirrored her own. Summer bled into autumn outside the cave, a fact she registered only by a subtle shift in the angle and duration of the sunbeam that was her garden's lifeblood. Inside her stone fortress, it was always the same cool, stable temperature. The passage of time was measured not by a calendar, but by the slow, miraculous development of the plants. First came the tassels, then the fine silk, and finally, the swelling of the ears within their pale green husks. Each stage of growth was a private, hard-won triumph. She would run her calloused hands over the developing cobs, feeling their increasing weight and substance, a tangible measure of her success against the odds. The mockery from the town had faded to a distant, meaningless echo. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of the cavern, to the needs of her crop and her chickens, and in that shrinking, she had found a strange and profound sense of freedom. She was accountable to no one but herself and the living things in her care. There were no neighbors to judge the unorthodox height of her corn, no passers-by to question her methods. There was only the work, the results, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of competence. She harvested the first ear of corn with the reverence of a priestess. She peeled back the husk to reveal rows of kernels. They were not a rich, buttery yellow, but a milky, almost pearlescent white. She cooked it over her small fire, and the taste was sweet, earthy, and utterly real. It was the taste of survival, the flavor of a gamble that had paid off. She harvested the rest of the crop methodically, leaving the stalks in place to be tilled back into the soil. She shucked the corn and laid the ears out on flat rocks in a drier part of the cave to cure. The sight of her harvest, a small mountain of pale gold, was more beautiful to her than any sunset. It was food. It was warmth for the winter. It was independence. It was her answer to the gavel, to the averted eyes, to the laughter in the general store. While the townspeople above ground rushed to bring in their own harvests, racing against the coming cold, Agnes worked in the calm, unhurried stillness of her sanctuary. Her crop was already safe, protected by 100 feet of solid rock. She was ready for winter. She had built her ark, not of wood, but of stone and soil and stubbornness, and now she could wait for the flood. The first flakes of snow began to fall outside, unnoticed by her as she ground a handful of her cured corn into meal, the grating sound of stone against stone, a rhythmic, satisfying song of self-sufficiency. The weather did not turn, it broke. The first snow was not a gentle dusting but the opening salvo of a war. A blizzard descended from the north, a ferocious, shrieking wall of white that slammed into the territory without warning. The townsfolk, caught off guard, had no time to prepare. The storm was a thing of violence, tearing at roofs, burying fences, and collapsing barns under a sudden, immense weight of snow. The wind howled like a chorus of grieving spirits, a sound that penetrated the thickest wooden walls and chilled the very marrow in a man's bones. Inside the cave, Agnes heard only a distant, muted whisper. The hundreds of tons of limestone above her head acted as a perfect insulator, turning the blizzard's deafening roar into a soft, almost peaceful hum. The profound quiet of her stone sanctuary, once a symbol of isolation, was now the ultimate luxury. She sat by her small, efficient fire, the air still and warm, and listened to the storm's muffled fury. It was a battle being fought in another world. Her system was being tested. The heavy wooden frame she had built for the cave entrance, braced with rocks, held fast against the growing drifts. Not a single snowflake found its way inside. Her water source flowed steadily, untouched by the freeze. Her chickens huddled in their coop, calm and safe. Her harvest, her precious corn, was dry and secure. The contrast was absolute: outside, a chaotic, life-threatening maelstrom; inside, a pocket of perfect order and stability. For 3 days, the storm raged. For Agnes, they were days of routine. She tended her chickens, ground her corn, and maintained her fire. She was not merely surviving, she was living, comfortably and securely, within the fortress she had built. The blizzard that was a crisis for everyone else was, for her, merely an inconvenience, a loud noise in the distance. She thought of the people in the town, of Mr. Hemlock in his store, of Roy on his farm. She pictured them huddled in their drafty wooden houses, feeding their fires, watching their woodpiles shrink, hearing the wind tear at their shingles. She remembered their smug faces, their easy mockery. There was no triumph in the thought, no sense of vindication. There was only a quiet, grim acknowledgement of the difference between a system built for appearance and one built for reality. Their world, the world of straight fences and tidy storefronts, was fragile. Her world, the world of rock and soil and water, was durable. When the wind finally died down on the 4th day, the silence that fell was more profound than the noise had been. The world was buried, transformed into a stark, undulating landscape of white under a steel-grey sky. She was safe. She had enough food, enough fuel, enough water. She had won. But she had a feeling the story wasn't over. The true test was not the storm itself, but its aftermath. The world that emerged after the blizzard was broken and starving. The snow was waist-deep, and a brutal, unbreakable cold settled over the land, freezing the world solid. The town was cut off. Roads were impassable. What little harvest had been caught in the fields was lost forever beneath an impenetrable crust of ice and snow. Barn roofs had collapsed, killing livestock. Food reserves, meant to last a normal winter, were already being rationed with a grim calculus of despair. Hunger, a cold and patient predator, began to stalk the town. In her cave, Agnes was an island of plenty in a sea of want. Her routine continued, a steady rhythm of work and sustenance that was an affront to the crisis gripping the world just beyond her stone door. She ate her cornmeal porridge, collected her eggs, and felt the deep, satisfying security of her preparations. But the silence of the post-storm world was soon broken. It was a sound she hadn't heard in months, a human voice, faint and desperate, calling her name. And then, a frantic knocking on the braced door of her cave. She opened it a crack, the frigid air a shocking slap in the face. Standing there, half frozen, his face gaunt and his arrogance stripped away to raw, animal fear, was Roy. The man who had mocked her stone farm was now standing at its door, a beggar. His own barn had collapsed, his winter stores ruined by snowmelt. His family was hungry. "Agnes," he stammered, his breath pluming in the icy air. We saw your chimney smoke. We didn't know if. We've got nothing left. The children." He couldn't finish. His gaze went past her, into the warm, firelit interior of the cave, and his eyes widened. He saw the neat stacks of harvested corn, the chickens in their coop, the impossible reality of her sanctuary. The sight broke him. All the mockery, all the smug superiority, dissolved into pure, desperate need. Here was her moral dilemma. It was not a question of forgiveness, that was a luxury. It was a question of arithmetic. She had a finite supply of food. Her system was designed for one person. To give food away was to shorten her own odds of survival. But to refuse was to listen to a neighbor's children starve, a weight she wasn't sure her conscience could bear. She looked at Roy's chapped face, at the shame and desperation warring in his eyes. He was not the same man who had laughed at her in the store. The storm had stripped him down to his essential, vulnerable self. She thought of her corn, each kernel planted with her own hands, grown in darkness, a testament to her will. It was hers, earned through ridicule and back-breaking labor. But what was the purpose of survival if it meant abandoning the last vestiges of humanity? She made a calculation, not of sentiment, but of capacity. "I can't feed the whole town," she said, her voice flat and practical. "But I can trade." Roy stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment, then understanding dawned. It was not a handout. It was a transaction. It preserved his dignity and her security. "Trade for what?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I have nothing, you have an axe," she replied. "And there is deadwood on the ridges the storm didn't bury. I need firewood. A week's worth of cornmeal for a month's worth of wood." Cut and stacked, it was a fair offer, an exchange of labor for sustenance. It was the beginning of a new economy, born from the wreckage of the old one. Roy agreed, his relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He became the first messenger, returning to the desperate town not with a story of a madwoman, but of a savior with terms. Soon, others came. They trudged through the deep snow to the mouth of the cave that had once been a punchline, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and shame. They came to barter. One woman, a skilled seamstress, mended Agnes's threadbare blanket and dress in exchange for a sack of corn. A man whose tools had survived his barn's collapse repaired her axe handle and sharpened the blade. And then, one day, Mr. Hemlock appeared. The storekeeper, a man of inventory and ledgers, stood at the entrance to her cave, his hat in his hands. His own store was nearly empty, his supply lines cut off. He had come not as a merchant, but as a customer. His gaze swept over her subterranean farm, the orderly rows of corn stalks, the stacked harvest, the ingenious water system. He was a practical man, and what he saw was not madness, but a system of genius, a fortress of foresight. "I was wrong, Agnes," he said, the admission costing him dearly. "I have candles. Lamp oil. Salt. I'll trade you for meal. Whatever you think is fair. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The outcast was now the linchpin of the community's survival. The woman they had dismissed was the one they now depended on. Agnes felt no gloating, only a quiet, weary sense of vindication. She traded with him, and with others, her dealings always fair, always based on the practical arithmetic of survival. The cave became the new center of the town, a place of commerce and hope. Her stone farm had saved them. When spring finally came, melting the snow and revealing a scarred and damaged world, Agnes was no longer an outcast. She was the woman who had grown corn in a cave, the quiet, stubborn widow who had understood the earth better than any of them. Her survival was not a miracle, it was the earned consequence of labor, observation, and a refusal to surrender. The work was not over. Another winter would come. But now, she would not face it alone. She had her system, her sanctuary, and the hard-won respect of a community that now understood the difference between a house and a home, between a farm and a fortress.